the think tank Demos. And we're delighted to be hosting this event because this piece of work has become increasingly important to what we're doing, but also, I think, to the national conversation this year. So we're here to talk about how we put communities in charge to build prevention into public services. And we are hugely grateful to Local Trust that has supported a whole stream of work we've been doing on prevention this year. We started off by producing this paper, making the case for reforming public services to become more preventative. And we followed it up with several pieces of work. One looking at how we can reform Treasury funding to get rid of the Treasury blocker that stops upstream investment. And we've also looked at a couple of pieces of work on prevention in practice. So we've done a piece around homelessness. We're doing a piece at the moment around mental health services. So there's an emerging body of work that we feel is really connecting with Labour's moment, where you hear Keir Starmer, Rachel Reeves and Wes Streeting in particular talking about prevention and this emerging commitment to prevention, but actually still some missing detail about how we're actually going to deliver it. So what we've done today is brought together a brilliant panel of people who care about this issue and have worked on this issue at every level, from national government to local government to community-led work, and for what I think will be a really, really interesting debate. I also just want to say a quick welcome to our online audience. We're live streaming on YouTube. It's lovely for people outside of this conference bubble to be able to join us as well. So just by way of introduction, I'm going to start by introducing Matt Leach on our far left, Chief Executive at Local Trust. And then we've got Kirsty McNeil, Executive Director of Policy Advocacy and Campaigns at Save the Children and prospective parliamentary candidate for Midlothian. Jack Birkinshaw comes to us from Staffordshire, where he's chair of the, how do you say this, Brereton. Yeah. Thank you. Million Big Local, which is a locally delivered programme that we'll hear more about. Councillor Jane Ashworth is the leader at Stoke-on-Trent City Council, who's thinking about how to tackle these challenges. And Professor David Halpern is President and Founding Director of the Behavioural Insights Team and has been incredibly influential over government policy for many years, and with this particular area of work being of interest. So I'm going to start by asking Matt to kick off and set the scene on what true preventative state built community up could look like.
Thanks, Polly. And again, I could do no more than recommend you read this excellent report. We're delighted to be a part of its production, working with Demos. Local Trust is a national charity which delivers a programme called the Big Local Programme, which Jack leads in his community in the Midlands. It's a programme which explores the furthest reaches of devolving power to local people. So we've heard a lot at this conference about the challenges of negotiating Devo settlements at a combined authority level, of the frustrations that district councils face when they deal with a myriad of Whitehall funding pots. But we probably have heard a little less about the way in which the potential of local people can be mobilised to make a real difference in local areas. And the Big Local Programme involves putting a large amount of money, in, I guess, comparative terms, £1 million, in the hands of local people and challenging them to come together and make the most of it over 10 years, using that money to lever in other resources to form partnerships and start to define what success means for their neighbourhoods and deliver it as well. And for those of you who are at an earlier Labour Together session, Sasha from Dyke House in Hartlepool is another representative of a community that's been doing amazing things with that resource. And that programme's given us a real privileged and amazing view of what local people can do when they're given time, when they're given support, when they're given the opportunity to take risks, to build partnerships that otherwise they'd be shut out from. And I could come out with a huge list, but I'd probably go on far too long. Instead, I think I'll talk about what we've learned. One of the most, I think, important bits of learning that's come from running this programme now for over a decade is the extent to which the challenges faced by communities are often defined not just by deprivation, but by where they're located, and also critically by the state of their social fabric, the richness of the institutions that underpin life in those areas. And often on the periphery of our former industrial towns and cities, we see communities which have suffered significantly. I'm sure the same is true in Scotland as in England, which has suffered from not just the industrialisation, the loss of traditional employment, the loss of transport links, of opportunity, but also the loss of social fabric, the pubs, the clubs, the bingo halls, the cafes, the places that bring people together, that enable them to support one another, to build that sort of autonomous kind of support that working communities would often have for one another. It actually is part of a different story of what makes labour. But in those places that are both deprived and lack social fabric, we've seen significantly worse social outcomes than places that otherwise are just equally deprived. You see places which have worse health outcomes, which have much worse outcomes when it comes to opportunities, where there's often much stronger perception that the streets aren't safe, where people feel locked out of economic growth. In fact, I could almost give you a list of Labour's challenges, and you would see, the missions, and the epicenter of those issues is often not distributed all over the place. It's in particular places, and often particular places that have been marginalised politically, socially, in terms of geography. And I'd argue that if Labour wants to make a difference when it comes to tackling these problems, it's got to tackle it in localities. It's got to look at making a difference at a neighbourhood level, and it's got to start by thinking about how it builds a community capacity in those places. And I think the second reason Labour needs to do this is because when communities go wrong, when things fall apart, when you lose those stabilising forces that help people live the lives they want to lead, the costs of that failure fall on the state, inevitably, whether it's the cost of dealing with crime, dealing with social care, dealing with the cost of environmental degradation. And at a time when Labour, as we've heard from frontbencher after frontbencher at sessions like this, is coming into power with limits on what it can afford, what it can spend, actually perpetuating a model where we enable parts of our communities to fall apart, imposing costs on the people who live there, awful costs, but also significant costs on the state, may not be something that we can sustain. I'd be interested to hear what Jane in particular has to say about that later. I think I'd just like to conclude by saying that Labour actually knows this. There is a strong record of Labour understanding this and doing something about this. If you think back to 1997, which is the last time a Labour leader, achieved a major change in British politics, the day after Tony Blair shook hands on Downing Street, he went to the Aylesbury estate in London and stood on that estate and said that actually what is really important is community. It's the way people relate to one another. It's the challenges that people face in communities where there's the complexity of not just poverty, there's crime, there's ill health, there's lack of opportunity, there's lack of education. And I argue that some of that spirit needs to be recaptured now. So 25 years ago, Labour launched the National Strategy for Neighbourhood Renewal. It set the scene for the New Deal for Communities, which was a programme which, evaluated 5 years after the 2010 election under a different government, actually found this was a programme that achieved most of its objectives. 11 out of 18 of its objectives it achieved. It offered great value for money. Rather oddly, since then, Labour has made nothing of that. This was a great success of the last Labour government. But research shows that it was genuinely a success. It was evaluated. It had impact. It had most impact where local communities were involved and in the lead in defining what happened in those communities, because it left a legacy behind, not just of stuff that have been done or services that have been delivered, but critically stronger communities, community institutions, the organisations that were set up and spawned by the New Deal for Communities, which have continued to advocate for, organise, make a difference, attempt to prevent costs falling on the state. Great examples of it still would be, for example, Be Inspired in Braunston, the former NDC there. So I think I'd argue that there is an opportunity now for Labour to reclaim that rich record of success, to talk about community, not just in terms of the relationship between local councils and national government, but to engage with the challenges of neighbourhood, to think about how we can tackle the places that have been left behind, that have missed out when it comes to funding, where people don't have opportunity, to bring them. And these are places often where people don't vote because they feel that actually there is no hope. I think there's a real opportunity to give hope there. I think finally, and this is not a heroic aspiration, but I think it's a real aspiration. There's been some really good research done in the United States about what makes communities feel normal. And I think most people actually just aspire to normality. They don't aspire to heroism in a sense. They just want to feel normal. And what the overwhelmingly, irrespective of income, and when you look at the big surveys of American life, you find that what makes people feel normal is being able to go to a place near your house where people recognize you and you recognize other people. It's the relationships. And I think finally, there's a lot of stuff around, get people out walking to prevent health problems. But actually, if we want to deal with health problems, we want to deal with loneliness and isolation, we want to deal with the costs that come from feeling that you've been left behind, your life's been missed out. Start to think about building opportunities for people to have a relationship at a local level, build the institutions that facilitate that.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thank you so much, Matt. What does this agenda look like in Midlothian where you are? And also I wonder whether you can respond a little bit to what Matt's kind of proposing there about this being more of Labour's story ahead of the next election.
Well, can I just actually start by thanking you, Polly, and the team. There's a lot of chat in the media at the moment that the sort of think tank scene isn't what it was perhaps in the late 90s, and I think it's dead wrong. It's utter rubbish. I think the British think tank scene is unbelievably lively at the moment, and Demos is a really, really big part of that. So thanks for convening these really important conversations. To Matt's first point, I mean, I would say that I'm not just a Labour candidate in Midlothian, I'm a Labour and cooperative candidate in Midlothian, and actually the cooperative party tradition is a really, really huge part of Labour's intellectual breadth. And the more we kind of reimagine and reinvigorate that cooperative tradition, which is rooted in place, it's rooted in relationship, the stronger the next Labour government is going to be, I believe. So I think there's 3 stages really in how we need to think about prevention and the preventative state. So the first stage has already been completed. And the first stage is really the adoption of mission-based government. And the reason that is important, and the reason that Keir's intellectual leadership there is important, is twofold, I think. Firstly, because a mission-based focus is by definition long-term. And if you want to get people to invest in prevention, and I know on this panel we'll probably talk about what the barriers to it have been historically, but if you want people to invest in it, you simply can't do that if they are thinking in cycles of quarters in terms of local government finance, or they're thinking in terms of election cycles at Westminster level. So we have this long-term focus built into the mission-based approach, which I think is really important. The second thing that mission-based government allows you to do is send system-wide signals. So it's by definition a new kind of doing government that involves co-production with lots of different sectors, aimed at an explicit goal that is shared. So I think stage 1 has already been completed, right? So I think you'll find very welcome friends in the Labour Party for this sort of approach. The second stage to me is how do we take that aspiration around mission-based government and put into a prevention plan? So making sure that prevention is hardwired into each of the missions, and to a huge degree that has already occurred. So just to give you a little sample of policy that's already been announced where Labour has this renewed focus. So we are looking at specialist mental health provision in every single school. Any of you that are parents will know that there's an absolute crisis in children and adolescents' mental health. So we're looking at a specialist mental health provision in every school. We're looking at drop-in centres for children and adolescents who have mental health problems in every single community. Labour's looking at breakfast clubs in every single school, looking at adopting a health in all policies approach, which would be very welcome to, I imagine, to those of you that have historically worked on public health, looking at a watershed for junk food advertising, looking at decent homes standard 2, and those of you who remember that in the last Labour government know how transformational the decent home standard 1 was. So that's going to be hugely important. We are looking at youth workers in every casualty, so A&E ward and in custody suites, and perhaps one of the most exciting of all, looking at how we do prevention through the New Deal for workers, because actually organised workers are best able to keep their workplaces healthy. So provision of new sick pay rights in that plan. So stage 2, I think, is actually getting really granular about how are we going to invest in prevention and which bits of the prevention agenda do we think unlocks most of the downstream benefit. So I think stage 2 is near completion, but obviously there'll be a lot of rollout of policy to come this side of the general election. The third stage is in many ways the most difficult, which is how do you rewire the culture of public service provision, but not only public service provision, the culture around how we determine our built environment and how we do economic and industrial strategy. How do we rewire all 3 of those things to put not just prevention at its heart, but the midwife of good prevention, which is relationships? So how do you make sure that every single bit of this is conceived of relationally? And, we should front up, but that can sound a bit woo, right? Like that can sound quite amorphous and difficult to pin down, but it's also worth saying that people used to say that about sustainability and people used to say that about equality. And now it's inconceivable that we would have an economic strategy, a public services strategy, or a built environment strategy that didn't have sustainability at its heart. And it's inconceivable that we wouldn't think about policy through that mindset of what's the equalities impact of this. So I think the third phase will be how do we generate a culture where we're also asking ourselves these questions of do these take us into a world closer in balance or further away from that world by hardwiring that culture of prevention and relationships. I want to leave you with this thought that this is not just incredibly important, which I think everyone almost by definition would agree because you've chosen to come to this today. It's not just incredibly important, but it's incredibly urgent. And I want to give you an insight from another sector that might help us understand why. So in the humanitarian sector, people talk about moral injury. And what that is a phenomenon in the workforce where if you're a frontline humanitarian worker, you are called to bear testimony, sometimes to the most appalling war crimes, human rights abuses, breaches of humanitarian law. You are called to bear witness, but you're also called to stay and deliver and make sure that life-saving assistance gets to people who need it. And people who have to balance those things every day are incredibly prone to burnout and psychological distress caused by this phenomenon of moral injury. I'm very familiar with that in the humanitarian sector, which I've spent many years. But I increasingly see its symptoms when I speak to frontline public sector workers here in the UK, because nobody joins teaching to gatekeep resources in their classroom and to work out which of the hungry kids in their classroom they're going to feed from their own pocket. Nobody joins the child protection social work force to say, I need to work out which child is getting an intervention on the basis of who's most likely to die today. No police officer wants to be going through the calls that they've had and working out what is the most serious risk of crime that's going to happen in the next few years. That's not why people join these professions. They join these professions not to be gatekeepers to services, but to be of service. Because we haven't designed prevention into the heart of everything, and because we haven't designed relationships into the heart of everything, I think there is a massive undiagnosed moral injury question that's occurring right across our services. So if we want to do the third phase, which I'd say I think is very much in line with kind of Labour thinking and the mission-based approach that we've taken, I think we're all of us going to have to advocate for the fact that just like sustainability and just like a focus on equalities, this isn't a nice to have when we get to it. This is absolutely foundational for everything that we might go on to achieve and what will follow.
Thank you. I'm so glad you got to point 3, because point 3 is what this conversation is about. It's kind of getting beyond that kind of reactive preventive service to actually the kind of foundational state of our society, relationships and community. And I'm really fascinated that you mentioned particularly that this is a cultural change. And I just want to put a pin on the question about culture change versus policy change. Like, what's the relationship between the two? If we want to create a culture change across public services, and this is something my colleague Ben Glover is looking at very closely in some work we're doing at the moment, what's the role of policy in that? So I'm just going to leave that question in the air while we get to the rest of the panelists, but I'd love to come back to that. Thank you. Jack.
Okay.
How does it look in the real world? Like, from the ground up, you're doing this. Tell us what you've been doing.
So from a resident's point of view, so back in 2012, Britain and Ravenhill was awarded £1 million, and the residents thought, wow, £1 million, what can we do with this money? Unfortunately, we couldn't have new patios or a holiday to Spain. We then started on the consultation with fellow residents on knowing what was most important to our residents. And out of that consultation was our park and open spaces. So we began the process of installing new park equipment, a gym, and resurfacing of our running track amongst another master plan of our park. Little did the residents know the amount of red tape that would be thrown in front of us. So we started around 2012 with the process, but it wasn't until 2014 that the first spade went into the ground. And that was incredibly difficult for a resident-led partnership to explain that to our residents. They were very used to their councils explaining delays, but for residents, it was very difficult. On from that, we continue with our master plan to this day. And we've just recently had our Volunteers Day, where local businesses installed new pathway, steps throughout the Woodland Walk, planters, and painting fences, plus much, much more that's planned for our park. I touched on the Woodland Walk, and it isn't just the fact that you walk through our wooded area. We use this for various different events. Some of those are campfire cooking with our youth group, forest school, eco-learning. For example, our local schools and youth group designed bird and bat houses, including bug hotels. Our area, like many, in 2014 lost our youth group and youth services. As a partnership, we felt we couldn't lose the incredible asset of youth work. So various members of the community trained to become youth leaders, and one of them is sat in the room with me today, Sue Merriman. And we continued our work with the youth. We don't just meet on a sort of Tuesday evening and do the usual, how I remember it, playing pool in a village hall somewhere. We've changed it, and we're now a volunteering youth group, and that means that our youth take ownership of our local area. So we paint underpasses that might have been graffitied, where we're waiting forever for local services to do that. The canal and river banks, we clear that. We also offer CV writing. We deliver holiday programs, help with schoolwork, and then also the unfortunate side of mental health in our youth groups, where they don't feel they can go to the usual service providers. So we're now working closely with a lady that is a counsellor, qualified counsellor, and hope to deliver more training on that. We then reward our youth group with fishing trips, days out at the local rifle club, and also trips out to Alton Towers and other local areas. The youth group also, during the COVID outbreak, came up with a remembrance garden, which was at the heart of our Woodland Walk. Unfortunately, as a group, we had some antisocial behaviour and felt that we had to remove that remembrance garden. However, a local Labour councillor called in a community trigger and asked Britain Million to be almost the chair of that group, and that was working with local services to bring into justice what had gone on in our park and the damage that we'd had. That meant that we worked with police, fire, social services, and then the police, with the parents, signed over the teenagers that caused the damage to our care and were then found volunteering for us. So a full circle round. During the COVID outbreak, just to touch on what we learned from that, because up to then we were running very much to our plan. So with Local Trust, the residents had to write a plan. And COVID car washed all of that. That was gone. So we started weekly planning meetings, worked with local partners such as the Co-op, Amazon and Morrison's, and we saw our volunteer database triple due to the furlough scheme. We started safely knocking on every single door in Britain. This was followed by our support worker finding a 90-year-old lady walking the streets during lockdown. She'd gone about 4 days without food as she'd run out. Her son, unfortunately, had COVID and couldn't look after her. So that meant Britain Million picked up the shortfall. And from that, we safely knocked on over 15,000 doors during the COVID outbreak. We left packages on doorsteps to include food, craft, gardening, mental health and PPE provisions. We also started collecting prescriptions for our residents unable to leave their houses. We started a Phone Buddies campaign, but then fastly learned that that didn't cover all disabilities in our area. So we started a doorstep buddies scheme. We also accompanied, to this day, elderly residents to doctor appointments and offer palliative care to our residents. From this, in 2021, we was the first area to receive a Compassionate Community Charter status, and we now support other areas in receiving their chartered standard, including a village in Japan. Working relationships is very important to us. We find it easy to work with our local businesses, which understand our goals and visions. However, the various levels of local government do not seem to understand the level of importance that community-led volunteering means. This includes our parish, district and county councils. What we did find with our parish council, however, that due to Brereton Million and residents taking ownership of their area, this year we had 14 residents step forward, and for the first time in 10 years we held an election in Brereton and Ravenhill, and we now have a fully resident-led parish council, not attached, unfortunately, to a political party. That was in the manifesto. As a group, we're passionate to continue to support our village and aspirations for the county as we move towards the end of local trust. All trustees have voted to continue past, and we have now formed our own charity. We've now found that local residents groups on the smaller scale wish to join us as a partnership so that we can help them tackle the red tape and hurdles that can be put in front of them. Just to run through very quickly, just to end, what we have provided our local residents in the time that we've been going. We've replaced 14 bus shelters, the War Memorial and Remembrance Day running, the village cleanups, planters, edible gardens, Save the Community Centre, community events including Winter Wonderland, open air cinema, Scarefest, very excited about that one, health and wellbeing programme that has now been adapted by a district council into an app, youth services, a community fund, a community shop, a resident support, budgeting and advice, cooking lessons, first aid training, installation of 5 defibs, and much, much more. But yeah, thank you very much.
Inspiring story, Jack, and congratulations on everything you've achieved and the community's achieved. I just wanted to ask quickly, how is one of the things we're looking at in building this kind of community-led prevention is how you transfer power from the authorities to communities to really have agency over what they're doing. And in your case, you had a very kind of particular kind of power. You had some financial power in terms of the big local funding. How did that change the relationship between the community and the council?
It's always been challenging. I think the money gave us, the council took us more serious. And we also had to teach the council that the money wasn't there for their cuts that they brought in. And that's where we found it really difficult, is what are we replacing as a cut? And as an organisation, now we're looking at our social care and prescribing that we're issuing. And we're really finding it tough to draw a line. And that's an answer we don't have, unfortunately, I would say.
It does sound tough, and I think it kind of picked up on what Kirsty was saying about that kind of partnership approach between communities and authorities. And so I'd love to turn to Jane next. As a leader of a council, kind of how do you think about this?
I think it's an interesting and immediate problem that faces us in Stoke-on-Trent. Labour took back control of the City Council in May. We lost it in 2015. And we took it back quite wholesomely a few months ago. And the minute we arrived, we potted into, the chief exec's office. We get a telling about, oh yeah, you've got no money. Your first 3-6 months are going to be spent entirely on sorting out your budgets, etc. We go, yeah. We know the opposite games. We've all played them at work, etc. We know your games. But it turned out to be vastly worse than anyone could possibly have imagined. And the reason for that was the structure and the way that children's services had been managed in the years that the Conservatives have been running it. But bear this in mind, because this is important to the storyline. They've been really keen on shouting how good they were at managing children's services. This was their thing. They'd be on the telly, they'd be in the local paper. That any opportunity they got, they absolutely banked their political credibility. And I think they would probably see it as their sort of validation of their moral worth, that they concentrated so much on children's services. Now, there was a problem when we got in. And that problem was that not only were we vastly outseeding the number of children we would expect to find in care, given our size and our levels of deprivation, not only was that true, and in a sense what we'd done is built a system which was highly effective in taking children into care, which was deeply unfortunate as the plan was not to. So the problem with that then, apart from the fact that it was intellectually abysmal, was a budget, right? They ate into the budget without having the integrity, brains, political sense, good sense, ability to add up whatever it was, which meant that they did not realise that the way that children's services were going meant that not only was it terrible for children that so many were in care, but critically we were very nearly on the edge of a 114 and whatever. As you know, that's the local authority equivalent of some form of bankruptcy declaration. Now, we look at this question, and I'm going to do something terribly eccentric and talk about the way that I approach the problem, because, as Matt was talking earlier, the learnings of the previous Labour government and the New Deal for Communities programme comes into play here. I myself worked in the Neighbourhood Renewal Unit. I was funded by Sport England. This is important, so I'll come back in a minute. My job was here's the Labour government's regeneration renewal programmes, here's the world of sport. I was funded by Sport England because I was the awkward one in Sport England, so quite happy to go away, go and look at that for 5 years. Do that. Bring together those two policy worlds to see how they fit together. As a result of that, became an understanding of how to do empowering youth work, play work through the medium of sport in the most disadvantaged neighbourhoods, which were embodied in an organisation called Street Games. At that moment, it was pretty clear the Conservatives were going to win the next election, so we ran away. We took Street Games with us and did off away from Whitehall and rooted ourselves in the 1,500 organisations that had decided to adopt that methodology to reach working class youth and turn them into young leaders. So that's relevant, okay? Now, the response that the local state took to the problem of so many children in care was, as I said, to emote all over the place, but also particularly to treat it as its component parts and then fail to do anything about it. Okay, so they failed to do the most basic preventative work around early help. And let's make a distinction here. So they failed in the early help. They were unable to address domestic violence. They were unable to talk about low income properly. They were unable to deal with the problems of mental health services. They were unable to deal with alcoholism. All those things, as we know, are critical factors in the biography of a child in care. Now, it's not hard, actually, for a local authority to say, well, go and sort that out, because it's within the culture, it's within the existing paradigm. Okay. What's harder is what we're now trying to do. What we're trying to do is take those lessons from the previous Labour government, plus a good dollop of common sense, and to say, what we're going to have to do here is preventative work. And we know that the best forms of preventative work are a sort of easy come, easy go, relaxed approach to community empowerment. I think it's a phrase we nicked from Immanuel Kant, actually. Something to do, somewhere to go, someone to go with, or something to do, somewhere to go, someone to talk to, that kind of pleasing and simple triplet, which can underpin what it is that you need to do in a particular neighbourhood. Now, this is where it rounds up. We know that people who turn up to a residents' association, by and large, are likely to be people who turn up to residents' associations. They're unlikely to be new people who come along, who want to join in, because the service that's on offer to them, or the opportunity or the leisure opportunity that's on offer to them, is what they want to do. So guess what, Probably quite a good idea to do that. So the first, and some might say the only thing we've been able to do so far, apart from trying to fend off the possibility of going bankrupt, is to move our leisure services department into what will effectively be a new unit within public health. So you will have children's services here for heavy end stuff and the official early help, and over here in the DPH you will have you'll have a unit that unites the two, where their job is to go out and develop and support community organisations. Now, why is it leisure? Why is that quite important? Well, it was there. It presented itself. To be quite blunt, the Director of Public Health just resigned. We had a gap, so we could swipe the budget while they weren't looking. And fundamentally, we know that we have massive problems with child poverty. There's one estate, Abbey Holton, massive white sprawling estate, had at some point in its own history elected the BNP. It's got a lovely little leisure centre with a little bit of grass out the front that's got a nice big fence around it. And if you walk a little bar just over the brook, 2 minutes away, there's a fixed play equipment playground. Oh, heaven to anyone who's ever had a background in either sport or play or whatever. So we will turn that, in effect, into some kind of children's centre, but not one of the sort that's being prescribed by the government as a family hub, although it may also have the services in due course, but a place to go. 3:30 every day, rock up there, nice lady on reception who lives around the corner, etc., etc., etc. 100 kids there on a Saturday morning will be my guess when we do it well. There you go. Massive relief of pressure on the families on that estate. Critically, we will find ourselves a gang of 15, 16, 17-year-olds, girls and boys, lads and lasses, whatever you want to call them, who we will develop into a leadership group there. Yeah. That's not hard. People have been doing that. Actually, some people will probably say people have been doing that since about 1842 when the YMCA worked out the value of boxing in the East End of London, I think. So there you go. It's not new, but it's gone. Okay. And I'm pretty confident that if we're able to develop and play along those kinds of things, and for me, obviously, I don't care whether or not it's a cutty outy sticky downy club that a 6-year-old is having with their lunch and a nice person to talk to. I don't care if it's that, or I don't care if the lads and lasses think they're pretending to play that they're at the World Cup. It really doesn't make any difference to me, provided you have the skills of the worker who can share and develop and empower a group of people to make some of their own plans. That will have a bigger advantage on that estate in terms of improving the quality of pressure of life, relieving the pressure on the parents, and of course, we'll be throwing in drug and alcohol abuse protectors. Of course we will. No one's saying that's a dead duck, but it is. We are saying that it's only a bit of the story. So preventative work it is for us.
Brilliant, thank you so much. I just wanted to pick out one theme from everything that's been said around children's social services, which Tommy here knows that I have a particular interest in because I wrote a book about children's social services. But I think it's such an important example because it shows all the things that are going wrong about how we're spending money in this country. So to the Stoke example, where practically going bust and spending so much money removing children, but not spending the time keeping families safely together and addressing all those deeply kind of foundational issues. What I found in my book is it's not only mental health and domestic violence and those kind of things. Those are the kind of symptoms of the deeper problems, which are poverty and inequality and really entrenched kind of unhappiness in certain parts of our communities. That actually vulnerable women are blamed for having the symptoms of and shamed and punished in the most dreadful way. And just two things that really cut through to me when I was researching that book. One was actually Tommy, who, do you mind if I tell that story? So Tommy's a social worker, and I did an event with Tommy where he said the thing is you just sit with the risk until you take them to court because you have nothing else to do to help these families. And that just said everything that was wrong with the system to me. And a separate event I did with maybe 100 social workers in the room, and I was asking them what's the difference between a family that stays together and a family when you remove a child, like what tips it over the edge. And they talked about mental health and domestic violence, all of those things. Eventually, what they agreed on, it was whether that parent, usually the mother, had someone looking out for them. And that comes back to that foundational point about where is the strength in the communities that can provide that support that stops those problems developing, and what can the state do to support those relationships to develop. So I just wanted to kind of capture some of these things. And by the way, the moral injury point for social workers is so true. They do things they don't believe in every day, and it's very, very painful. I wanted to kind of capture that and tie those things together, because we know this, and successive governments know this, and we've tried it. Why is it so hard to get the funding and the policy to a more preventative place? And that's what I wanted to put to David.
Thanks. A history of failure. I'll take that one in. By the way, it's lovely to be here, and thank you for inviting me to the panel. I've been a creature of central government for quite a long time, from the Blair administrations forward, and it's lovely to be out at a party conference. Look, let me just answer your question, but just very briefly, even for a kind of creature of the centre, why does this matter so much? Preventive state, relational state, you call it. I mean, three basic reasons, and then I'll just answer your question directly. I mean, number one, just to remind ourselves, it's because most problems in the world get solved by people directly themselves with other people. You know, a ball gets kicked in your garden, you kick it back, you know, whatever. And be it up there leaves or ice on front of your path and someone's going to slip, you call up the council or someone else, can you know, or do you just get a broom and sort it out, right? And of course, if you've got difficulties, you go to your friends and your network, and generally people around you help you. We saw that at spectacular level, despite the horror of it in COVID, and as you track these things. So social trust, you think other people can be trusted in Britain, is at 40-year high. But for the most part, because people's experience of life in Britain was people did help each other. It wasn't true in all countries, and doesn't mean it was trust in government, but people's experience was pretty positive. And if you go back even to kind of classic Coleman paper on social capital in 1988, one of his seminal examples, you're trying to understand why it was that Catholic schools in the US performed better than non-Catholic schools. And it basically boiled down to, you skip school, does someone else see you and just say, hey, Polly, when you're supposed to be in, you know, school, right? Or I tell your parents, right? It's because you have a network of a closure of the community. This is self-solved, right? It solves problem for itself. It's extraordinarily powerful, a kind of mutuality. Similar, of course, with, you know, you want to create a state, as it were, a relational state, you call it, which holds things with people, right? Because that's, you know, and there are extreme forms of that across the world, which are really interesting. Oh, we never do that. The Japanese system, probation system, criminal justice rests heavily on volunteers, right? It's not professionalized. You go out and someone volunteers to look after someone, you know, to reconnect them into kind of positive social, you know, capital. On health, I mean, when big society was being kicked around and of course died of death spectacularly, but one of the areas where certainly we had interested in, but, you know, the PPM would never do it, but at that point, was what about on health? The idea that instead of building a health service, which is, you know, your doctor will solve your problem, how much could it be mutuality? You know, so if someone's got a chronic condition and you help them, would you like to help somewhere else? Or, you know, do you say to relatives, you know, the visiting hours are the following, or do you say, we'd really like you to come and spend time in the hospital and we'll treat you? So there's a so-called patient hotel in Lund that does that more actively, better clinical outcomes, lower cost, higher satisfaction. So you can design potentially that, and go back to Putnam, 93, making democracy work. It's an astonishing result, really. It's 30 years old now. When you try and explain variations in performance of, in this case, regional government in Italy, that is literally the proportion of bell ringers in the community or choral clubs explains the performance of your government. Because if you've got citizens like that, they pay their taxes, they mutually support, you know. So it's really powerful stuff. And of course, finally, it's important because it's etiologically important in its own right. How long you will live depends on the strength of your social networks. And do you literally or metaphorically think people will stab you in the back? It's an enormous effect size. You know, the Lindholm study often quoted social isolation is worse than 15 cigarettes a day, etc. But we don't then act on that stuff, which, to your question, well, why not? It's like, oh my God, this stuff is amazing. You know, sort of the broccoli of the policy world, the super vegetable. So where is it? Where's our department? We have departments on human capital and so on, but where's it on social capital? It's so marginal. And I think there are three basic reasons. Number one is actually our psychology. So we are blessed or cursed with some of the weird psychology. We see the world through individual human causes. It's your fault that you're doing this, right? You know, it's about, we see our Gestalt focuses on the individual factor. That's on left and right, obviously even more on the right. And we're very poor at seeing the sort of field influences that actually drive our behavior, which is why you get the madness of obesity. We can't take on the, you know, the obesogenic environment, or we see it again and again and again, this breathtaking lacuna, because partly we don't see those other kinds of factors. Secondly, you have a kind of almost, if you like, administrative failure. People don't live in, you know, local areas or as an individual. We live in social networks, right? That's actually how we live our lives, but our data doesn't reflect that. Our analysis doesn't reflect that. I'm perpetually harassing, you know, Matt at the other end of the table about also, you'll have to figure out what exactly is the effective ingredient to intervene in those areas. But we haven't got the measures or the values in the first place to even see us still. You see what I mean? So you realize there's a scale of the administrative failure. And then the last one, of course, is basically political, which relates, I think, to the weird, which is that successive governments, and involved quite a few, are terrified. They are terrified as enough as anything akin to nanny state, but even more so if it starts touching on the world of relationships. You know, there's very strong grounds on a number of administrations, for example, on parenting. Well, what can we do more to support families and parenting, and deep nervousness to get involved in that territory. So I think we should obviously redouble our efforts and just to fully square up to the failure. I mean, some of us had to go late inside the Blair administration. We were at work on social capital. We had to go and try to revisit this in this what's called the policy review process, and hand over to Gordon as to couldn't we double down on these things which haven't been done. Obviously, the failure in the Cameron administration and the coalition on big society. So it's kind of fallen a few times, but we should pick ourselves up and just say this stuff is phenomenally powerful. It really matters on all those three levels. And actually, finally, the imagination to say, well, what does it mean? What if you were really serious about this as a policy agenda? What would you do? What would be the policy implications? They are quite radical and disruptive. Well, at least let's try and rehearse those and say, well, give it a run. Maybe try it in some particular local areas, of course, and see if it actually does deliver the scale of results that we think, and then everybody else will follow it, be it Wigan or whatever.
Thank you very much. Thank you. So our next stage of the work in this is called building the preventative state. So it's kind of how do we move towards this and really implement it. And one of the challenges that we see in that is that actually there's pockets around the country already doing this. I can see Chris was at Buckingham Dagenham and running the council there, and they did huge amounts around this. Wigan, Camden, there are places that are really working this already, and the difference between kind of policy levers and that is, I think, leadership. So I wanted to come back to your point around culture versus policy. How do we make this happen at a bigger scale than individual brilliant leaders seeing the way and leading the way, because that's not always sustainable?
So I think possibly three things. So first of all, one of the reasons that I work at Save the Children, so thank you for your service in the children's workforce. My mum was a care leaver, and it's because of that family experience. I know that good and bad childhoods follow people around forever. Right? You have one shot to get this right, and because of that sort of sense that good and bad childhoods follow people around forever, we have tried to, in my day job at Save the Children, try to get the system to be responsive to children and their interests. And actually, it's not particularly set up to do that. The Treasury thinks of people as savers, as mortgage holders, as pensioners, as employers, as workers, but actually people live in families, and children certainly do. And it's been really quite hard, and that's why I'm so excited that kind of Bridget has this fantastic new mission to think about opportunity at every level, because it's been incredibly hard to get the current government to conceive of childhood and children as something for which it is responsible beyond schools. So we had to challenge the original terms of the COVID inquiry did not mention children once. Right? So if you want a measure of how little children and their interests are conceived of in policy, think of this. After lockdown, pubs were open before schools. As a matter of policy design, we had people in bars before we had kids back in classrooms, right? Which just tells you everything you need to know about how seriously children's interests are taken. So I think there's something about how do you make policy responsive to children, because if you want to think about prevention at the meta level, these are generational effects when we get them wrong. The second thing is, I'm not sure we can separate policy and politics, and I don't mean that in the trivial sense that politicians make policy. I mean that in actually a deeper sense, which is, if we want to get public sector reform right, if we want to get crime policy right, if we want to get our economic or industrial strategy right, we want to get any of these things right, and we want public involvement in them, people get involved in community work and they work relationally when they believe two things are true. First of all, that their solidarity matters and that someone else's fate is bound up with them. But secondly, when they believe they've got agency. And you can have the highest sense of solidarity in the world, but if you don't believe that your actions will make any difference whatsoever, it's an incredible ask of people to get involved in any of this. And this is why I think one of the reasons that the big society went wrong was partly because it was used as a cover for austerity and it wasn't backed by any other government support for working relationally, and partly because it was completely dependent, once again, as so much is, on women's unpaid labour. We've already got a wildly unequal distribution of caring responsibilities in this country, and then to ask people to pick that up on top was simply too much. So you cannot separate how we how we distribute caring responsibilities, but also how much people feel able, in a pure time sense, but also in a wider sense, how much they feel able to get their voices heard. And that's why I would commend to people not only this document, but the Brown Commission, which talked about how all these different kinds of reforms have to be mutually reinforcing. Like, they have to be designed to be mutually reinforcing. And if I could say just one final point, there's a question around the culture of which workforces we value. And actually, the public sector workforce, absolutely superb. Our NHS heroes, take nothing from them. Our military, our police officers, the service that those people are rendering is extraordinary. But so too is the service of our community workers, of our play workers, and of our youth workers, our family support workers. And if we could, as a society, start to have the same level of esteem for those people who are doing that upstream work as we do for those people who do the crisis response, I think our society would be very different indeed.
Thank you. I'd love to bring in some audience questions. So, lady on the right, gentleman in the middle, and Tommy starting off.
Hi. Can I just say, I was going to be really dry, and instead I'm like, which is really nice. Thank you for what you said about. Sorry, had a very long day. Thanks for what you said about moral injury, because this eye bag is sponsored by John Butler's Jamaica Project. This one is sponsored by doing a frontline shift on Friday morning. I work at a frontline youth homelessness centre in London. I'm here today representing 110 charities who all work with young people across the UK, who are doing all of the firefighting. We are the net that catches the young people who get pushed through all these systems, don't get the corrective support they need, don't have people who can help them when they're pushed into crisis, and we are drowning, and I won't talk about it because I will cry. But we have all pulled together in sort of like the lead up to the general election, because there's some really, really small organisations, and then you've got really big ones like Centrepoint and YMCA. We have so much data about what's going on and what happens at the other end of stripping away all of these services for over a decade. How do we take that back to you, the big guys at the think tanks who we never really speak to, and sort of tell you what we're seeing? Because we also know what the solutions are. It's not an intractable and solvable solution. We know exactly what were the things that were put in young people's place that mean they end up on our doors, maybe already on the streets. We know exactly what those policy changes are, but it's really difficult for us to have a voice in sort of forums like this, and also to bring young people with us. I didn't have the option of bringing any of the young people that I worked with this week, but they'll tell you what they think, and they'll be much more excited than I am. So how do we sort of work with you to get that back in and try and get some of that money back further upstream so that I don't have to cry every day at work?
And what's your name and organisation?
My name's also Polly. I work at New Horizon Youth Centre, which is based in Camden, but we work with anyone in Greater London who's under 25 and is unsafe. You should come, yeah, feel it.
Thank you. Does any of the panel want to come back on that point? I kind of think it was a bit for me as well, kind of how do we work together? And I think that is critically important. Sometimes think tanks have been too kind of in isolation, and actually how we position ourselves in a system as a bridge between the political worlds and the community worlds, when all of our work is based on putting people at the heart of policy making. So I'd love to pick up the conversation with you after. It's not just your name's Polly. Gentleman in the middle.
Yeah, Tom from Cliff. Tiny Despair, you know, that. We work with a lot of community organisations helping them collect that kind of like impact data. It's a very similar question actually of when you've got examples of things that are working fantastically, whether that's instead of a trend or otherwise, like who is waiting to copy them, and like how can we encourage more people to do that? Because it feels like at the moment great things happen, and then they're limited to that area or that place in time. Like how can we do more of it?
I'm going to take that question with Tommy's if that's all right.
Yeah. I wanted to ask a bit more about how we get the change in practice with the culture. As was mentioned, I'm a social worker and I work in an edge of care team. So working with teenagers who are at risk of coming into care and trying to stop that from happening. And I think anecdotally, I know that my team saves probably hundreds of thousands, if not millions of pounds a year in terms of preventing children from coming into care. But I think nonetheless, when you kind of go to a senior manager and you ask for a preventative measure to be put in place for say a couple of £1,000s, you often get laughed out of the room with the idea that that's wishy-washy in some way because you're asking them to go swimming or for kind of a good thing to do. And then the next week they come back and they're coming into care and it costs £30,000 a month and we've wasted tons of money. And I guess for this to work, we kind of need to be in a position where social workers can go into the room and not be laughed out of the room for giving ideas of preventative things, but that actually that preventative stuff can be changed. And I guess I was interested to know people's thoughts on where impact measurement comes into that, because I think even though there's really good evidence more widely that preventative stuff works, it's quite difficult to prove a negative when you're actually walking into a room and saying, if we did this, then we'd save 30 grand a month because they won't be in care. And so it's quite difficult to prove how much money we've saved and that hasn't had to be spent. I wondered what people's thoughts were on that for practitioners as well, so that we can actually be in that room and have some evidence behind us.
I wonder if we can take those two ideas. So one, how can we scale good practice? And two, how can we prove the value of prevention? And ask each of the panelists to kind of just sum up with between that kind of culture and policy kind of spectrum, what are the things Labour should do right away to make a difference on prevention? Is that all right to you? So Matt, do you want to go?
I'm going to be unhelpful and say I think they're slightly the wrong questions and coming from the wrong direction. When it comes to, I think David earlier talked about the importance of social capital, about the importance of social institutions in places to bind them and hold them together, and the impact that has on everybody who lives in places in terms of the demands that are placed on, organisations and particularly state organisations. I ran a community football team aimed at kids who otherwise couldn't afford to play in Kentish Town, drawing people from Lismore Circus to Torriano Estate. I know what it's like there. And often what we were doing, as much as giving people a place to play football, was providing informal support, family to family, right across, those places, providing stability where otherwise there wouldn't be stability, and providing structure and helping take the edge off cases that might otherwise move into critical need. But I think what's important is not so much that what we did there was effective. I hope we were kind of effective. We certainly changed some lives, but that we were there. And I think when Jane said she didn't mind if it was cutting out sticky things or kicking a ball, she had it right. What's important is the richness of stuff in communities. It doesn't matter what, whether it's sport or it's craft or it's about, we can look at the stats and we can see that in places which are deprived and where you don't have that stuff, actually it gets much worse, much faster. That's where you get more care cases. That's where mental health cases are way off the scale. If you just map levels of lung cancer between places, in the lowest decile of the IMD, you find places with low social fabric have 70% higher lung cancer rates. There's almost everything goes bad when you don't have stabilising structures in communities. And I think the real challenge for the state when it comes to dealing with this endless rise of demands, driven by demography, driven by economics, driven by, atomization and failure, is that you're not going to be able to cope with that unless we can find ways to sort out communities so that they don't need to impose those failure costs, so they don't put the pressures on Jane's budget, which means she can't do all the stuff that she needs to do and is obligated to do. So sorry, I answered your question by saying it was the wrong question and answering a different one, which is incredibly bad form, and I'll stop now.
I kind of think you answered it as well, because what Tommy, you were saying that you can't prove it. You're kind of saying we're not doing the obvious things because you can't measure the direct impact of them.
Well, there are certainly incredibly strong associational links between poverty and a lack of social fabric and stuff being a lot worse for you than if you're just poor. I was talking to a chief exec of the Northeastern local authority who was talking about how he goes out and he walks ward to ward between wards that are equally deprived, and there are some wards where it's buzzing with stuff, things are going on. You can just offer a small grant or access to a room or broker a partnership, and stuff happens that's positive, that makes the community better. Then you go into the next ward that on the face of it has the same social stats, but there's nothing going on. There isn't the depth of organisation. They're getting no grants from the lottery because nobody's applying for them. And there people are just waiting for local authorities, for social services to pick up the costs of it. And, you know, we can't sustain it. This isn't about the big society. It's about what we can sustain. It's not about handing over services to charities. It's about trying to find ways in which the failure costs don't fall on all of us one way or another.
Thank you, Kirsty.
So in direct answer to your question, Polly, I might differentiate what we can do straight away and what we need to start straight away, because I think the whole focus that Keir has on the missions is these are necessarily long term, and we need to move away from this very, very short term crisis response kind of politics that we've had. So I think we need to start right away implementing the missions and creating the architecture of government that will allow us to kind of monitor and do the impact measurement of all that kind of work. The sort of second thing I'd say to your point, Matt, about what differentiates wards that are working from places that they aren't. Certainly in my patch, like the people that provide services in minors' welfares, like are holding our communities up, right? So these are spaces that theoretically are social spaces, but my God, they are doing so much work in adult education and in health prevention. And I quite often think, you know, like, to go back to your question about how do we make sure that different colleagues have professional esteem. If you live in a safe community, thank a youth worker, right? That people are doing so much upstream work that's going unrecognised, and I hope they will never be unrecognised by my party. And I do think if we could have one shift that would be immediate, if there is a change of government, and that is, it is such, and I hope you'll forgive me for making this partisan point, it is such a disreputable form of politics to demonise entire professions in the way that the current government has adopted a rhetorical approach of doing. So whether it's kind of the charity wokerati who could stick to their knitting, or the lefty lawyers, or whoever it happens to be, like that's not how you unite and progress the ambitions and aspirations of a country. So I hope that just like not just the day one difference, but the minute difference that you would get under a Labour government is that you'll never get anything other than a thank you for us for what you're doing with kids that are in danger, for what you're doing for kids that are in danger. Like it's not going to be a politics that is dependent on dividing people by design. It's going to be a politics that says everyone's got a part to play in transforming the country and fulfilling the missions and making sure that we can meet our aspirations collectively as a country, not aspirations for some, but aspirations for everybody.
Thank you so much, Jack.
Okay, yeah, so I'd probably share a lot of what the three of you have raised, really, and it's incredibly tiring as volunteers, even as sort of paid social workers, to also get the respect that is deserved is quite difficult. And I think for Labour, it would be important to remember what we are all about, and the fact that we will still be here after a general election, after you're in office. The social workers, the volunteers will still be on the streets doing the dirty work. I think from a big local point of view, our 150 areas has a really strong togetherness. We know that each area can get in touch with a fellow big local area and draw on their experiences. So I think from other areas, social connect is really important, and maybe some of these think tanks can help administrate that, to bring these people into a room together where they can share experiences and it can be properly documented. I think that would be a really good thing. And also touching on your bit about the politics of it, to try and keep it out a little bit, because it's going to be a problem that all government politicians are going to be facing. So I think what you were saying is really strong as well. So I agree with where you're coming from, is what I'm saying. It wasn't a negative. And I agree with what David was saying earlier on with the 3 points. And I think it needs to be taken more serious. And I'd welcome Labour to take on that massive hurdle, really, that it's going to be.
Thank you so much, Jane.
Yeah, a couple of things. First of all, in terms of the cultural question, from our point of view, I think, well, actually, this is, to begin with, this is from my point of view. We need an alliance of disruptors. We need the people who intend to get this sorted out are networking, sharing, reinforcing, hanging around together, coming up with plans, testing things out, sharing this, that, and the other, and it's all the rest of it is quite obvious. I think it has to come from people. It doesn't have to come from the DCS. It doesn't have to. It has to go, because they are, well, so busy and the mind is so populated with the terrible situations they find children in, that they're probably not the best people to do it anyway. So I don't think this necessarily has to come from the professional top to make a change. But that said, that doesn't mean to say there isn't a role for a Labour government. And I think the tactics that were used by Blair through setting up the policy action teams, 10 of them, 12 of them, whatever they were, which reset the direction of travel for various lines of social intervention, professionalism, etc., etc. That was a good idea. That functioned as a proper focus for national reset. So I think that would be handy, because we need a national conversation about how we intend the state to function, particularly in my interest, in so far as children's well-being is concerned. I think in terms of managing bosses who don't get it, I suspect that one of the drama in the proper sense of the social workers in Stoke-on-Trent is that their toolkit is empty. So they find a youngster who, in all probability, if they could go and play the trombone on Tuesdays and play football 3 days a week and then go camping with the scouts over the weekend, they probably would not end up in care. There'll be a lot of them. And the social workers don't have a toolkit of approved, regulated organisations. That might be the scouts, it might be a football club, but where we know the child will be safe, and ideally where a leader of that organisation is more genned up than your average to deal with the issue. I think you would find then that you get a relaxation of the drama that's going, of the problem that's faced by social workers, and that's in the right sense of drama. Second point quickly is when we're talking about actual assessing how the value, my intention is not simply to look at the trend of number of children going into care, adjust it according to the change demographics, etc. Yes, we will do that trend analysis, but we need to do a population-wide survey on efficacy and trust, I think. We need to get a feeling for what it's like in some of the estates at the moment, and I think those will be significant shifts. The results of that sort of survey, we'll do it now, we'll do it in 2 years' time. Well, however we plan it out, I think you will see significant changes if we are able to do some of this preventative work well. That'll do. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And David, so
Right.
what would you start?
Well, first I'd be square about what it's about. It's about, I don't think anyone's quite used to the phrase, about love and caring for each other. It's certainly true when you quote Josh's work right in here about young people. I mean, what you really need is you want someone to love you. You don't want a kind of overly bureaucratic thing. You want someone who's really unconditionally going to be there for you. Or a seminal study on depression, Brown and Harris, with working class women, it wasn't just a crap kept happening in their lives quite often. It was a combination of stuff happening and their relationships were letting them down, right? So that's really important. What does it mean? I mean, one of the things, just to press back a tiny bit on the remarks, the examples we had, kind of cost-benefit analysis, like does it really work, does it not? You know, we can make the argument on cancer drugs because you could do a study on it. It's not enough to win the argument saying it seems plausible. We're afraid we do have to do the work, and similarly, youth clubs is a very strong smoking gun, right, in terms of what's happened to expenditure, what's happened to crime, etc. But to show it, that's a different level of effort. So we certainly, an advice is get going as fast as you can on trying out these innovations, robustly, evaluate them, including the spillover effects. That's partly the magic of it. Also makes it hard, right? Social capital throws off these positive So one form of capital, if you keep using it, you actually get more of it, right? It spills over. Also go beyond it. What are the things of non-state actors around where there's room for innovation? Social media is not very social. What are forms of it which work? How do you connect people? How do you solve what's called the economics of bad neighbouring? So how would I know on my street who's got a ladder I could borrow? Why do I buy my own? Or who could help me with, like, these are sort of solvable problems if you think about them, which don't only have to be done by the state, but we want it to kind of happen. And then, just lean into, it's not, of course, narrowly just community. I mean, we use the word company for business because why do we use the word company? It's a groups of people who come together to support each other. Best predictor of engagement, one of the core ones. Do you have a best friend at work? Firms hate it, but it's like, what do we do about that? It's like, well, you can sort of see why it would matter. How do you even know if you're an employee trying to choose a good place to work? So there are things you can do to sort of reveal it, but sort of sharpen, if you like, market pressures to make markets nicer, including the way that they operate. Let's just kind of put them up. I mean, behavioral insights, some of you might know, maybe some of you read Thinking Fast and Slow. A lot of behavioral science had big breakthroughs on, auto enrollment, etc. Most of what our brains are doing are not doing Danny and, Tversky and Kahneman working out the probability of something and being prone to error. Our brains are mainly undeveloped because we're social creatures. We're trying to figure out, why did that person ignore me? Do I offend them? Right? You're keeping track. The incredible thing about humans is our ability to not just know those around us and care for them, but also we cooperate with relative strangers. Our brains are basically social creatures. It's social cognition. And it's interesting that it's gone into policy, the idea that, we might be prone to certain kind of errors and we should change the thoughts on pensions. But that's not what mostly our brains are about doing. It's about the social side of cognition. And that stuff hasn't penetrated into policy, right? It's a weird thing. So anyway, hopefully this time around, after the next election, we'll see.
I'm going to try, and I'm not going to take any more questions because we do need to wrap up, but we'll stick around and we can chat more. I'm going to try and sum up what we've just heard. I think the kind of breadth is just stunning, and I'm going to be thinking about this conversation for a long time. But the kind of culture change that's needed, the underpinning policy changes that can support that to happen. But there are a few words that really leaped out to me. Relationships, absolutely core, putting love back into, or finding the love in how we work together. Solidarity and agency, things that are so important to people. What you start to hear in all of that is a narrative and a story. And I think that's kind of half of the battle for Labour, is finding the language to talk about this that doesn't seem too soft and fluffy and relationshipy, but can actually make the hard case for this, because I think there's something in this that appeals very deeply and viscerally to everybody's lived experience in this country, if we can find the story. But I think we kind of started it today, and that's something we'll take into our work. So thank you, everyone on the panel, in the audience, for a brilliant conversation.